over 350 years, the 104th Regiment, with its brave ranks of citizen soldiers, built a proud tradition upon an impressive record of achievements. It has a tradition of battlefield bravery in times of war, a tradition of community service in times of local crisis, and a long and unparalleled record of success. Established in 1639 as the Springfield Trained Band, later becoming the Hampshire Militia, the 104th is the second oldest American military unit in existence. Its record of valorous service during King Philip's War, the French and Indian Wars, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Persian Expedition, World War I, and World War II resulted in the 104th becoming one of the most decorated units in American history. In this documentary, the regiment's story is told through the archival documents, photographs, film, and artifacts from our collections, and from the 104th veterans themselves. The Springfield Library and Museums Association is proud to bring you the story of the 104th and of the men who dedicated their lives to this country under its banner.
From the Indian Wars of the 1600s to recent natural disasters, Massachusetts men and women have proudly protected their state and country as citizen soldiers. The 104th has been there from the very beginning, from its first incarnation as the Springfield Train Band in 1639, 3 years after the founding of the town itself, to its work today as part of the Massachusetts National Guard. The soldiers of the 104th have proudly defended the Commonwealth and, when necessary, their country.
Throughout history, even though technology and weaponry has seen some vast changes, I think the individual guardsman's commitment to service of his country and of his neighbors has not changed at all. The uniqueness of the 104th lineage and history is, as far as Western Massachusetts and the Connecticut River Valley goes, they can trace their lineage right back to the formation of the Hampshire Regiment during the settlement of Springfield. The unique thing about this lineage is it predates many of the so-called honor units in European armies. The 104th Infantry Regiment has an older lineage than, say, the Coldstream Guards of the British Army. And it's something that I think we should look upon with pride.
The train band was the English name for a group of militiamen. All men between the ages of 16 and 62 were obliged to join the militia, with the exception of ministers, schoolmasters, and the infirm. Few doubted the need for an organized group of men who could defend the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Militia training was taken very seriously. Failure to provide the necessary equipment for training resulted in severe penalties. Fines as much as 25 pounds, for some the equivalent of 2.5 years of wages.
In Springfield here, the training took place up the hill where the present-day Springfield Armory Museum now stands. That was the training ground. The training was for a period of a day, on an appointed day by the General Court, and your training consisted of probably a few hours of military drill, and generally broke up quite rapidly and followed by general socializing.
For the train band, the first real challenge came in 1675 during King Philip's War.
The trained band was called up to protect the Connecticut River Valley settlements at that time. They were augmented by other militia units from the Boston area and also from the south in Hartford. And they went to the defense of Hadley. Some of the famous engagements at that time were up in the Deerfield area at Bloody Brook and Hadley, the attack on Hadley in Northampton at the time. That was basically the first baptism under fire of the Springfield militia.
The train band used the only tactics it knew, European tactics. They drilled in solid blocks of men using muskets and the pike. Since the primary responsibility of the train band was the protection of their own homes from attack, they quickly found these tactics of limited use. Then, as now, militiamen were paid for their service, though not always in money.
The colony could not pay them in cash or in specie. Quite often they were given grants of land. Many of the militiamen that served in King Philip's War were given grants of land in the Berkshires.
Between 1690 and 1763, the colonial military forces were engaged in the French and Indian Wars. Many Springfield soldiers fought, and many soldiers were lost during these years. In April of 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord prompted the South Hampshire Regiment, as today's 104th was then known, to rush to the Patriot cause. These men were involved in several of the major battles of the Revolution, including the Siege of Boston, the Battle of Bennington, and the defeat of Burgoyne, whose surrender at Saratoga essentially ended the war in the North and marked a turning point in the war for the American colonies.
Very remarkable point about that battle was that, again, it was the so-called untrained citizen soldier that defeated regular British troops under very good British leadership at the time. And so it was a terrific psychological blow to British command at that time. During the American Revolution, the troops now would be using the flintlock musket, which allowed them to fire much more rapidly than utilizing the matchlock of their ancestors 100 years previously. The musket also was able to mount the bayonet, so you no longer needed pikemen.
At the outset of the Revolution, the Americans were able to use some of the tactics they had learned from Native Americans during the French and Indian Wars. Contrary to popular folklore, by the end of the American Revolution, the Continental Army was soundly trained and utilized English and German standard military tactics.
The standard British tactic at the time was what modern historians now call linear warfare, where there were long lines of redcoats, shoulder to shoulder, arrayed across an open field. That tactic was used because of the inaccuracy of the smoothbore musket utilized. What they were doing was massing their fire. During the Revolutionary War, the militia system came under direct command from the Boston military commanders that were appointed by the great General Court of Massachusetts. And there was a extensive network of command all the way through the state.
A major contribution of the 104th to the new nation in the early years was its assistance in quelling Shays' Rebellion, a revolt by Western Massachusetts farmers, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, against foreclosures on their land.
Militia was called up to check Shays' rebels from attacking the arsenal at Springfield and obtaining more firearms and shot.
During the War of 1812, troops from Western Massachusetts were called into federal service in Boston for a time after British troops invaded Washington. However, they did not see action because they were, by state law, not allowed to leave the state. From 1814 to 1860, Western Massachusetts militiamen continued their drill and their training, but were not in federal service. However, when shots were fired on Fort Sumter in 1861, ushering in the Civil War, men of Western Massachusetts joined up with the rest of the North to preserve the Union.
This was the first time that the citizen soldier was faced with a national draft. The North needed large numbers of men to answer the call to arms, but this was also fulfilled by joining the local militia.
The men of the 10th participated in many of the key battles of the Civil War: Yorktown, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. The Civil War saw the bloodiest battles of our history, the tragic result of tactics that had not caught up with technology. While troops were still often massing on battlefields facing off against one another, faster firing and more accurate guns were able to kill more men. Moreover, medical skills were woefully inadequate to deal with the wounds that occurred on the battlefield. More men, in fact, died of wounds and illness than were killed outright on the battlefield. It was also during the Civil War that regiments were numbered. Naturally, the first regiment raised in the state would be named the 1st Massachusetts, and so on.
Through the years, there were always major changes in this numbering system, and as troops and strengths of various units ebbed and flowed, number designations would change. As they were incorporated into larger units, the designations would change also. We find a lot of change coming during the peaceful years between wars, where many units were consolidated into one larger unit, given a new number designation.
During the period after the Civil War, while the United States of America was engaged in wars against the American Indians in the West, no local units were in federal service. The next major conflict was the Spanish-American War of 1898. Members of the 2nd Massachusetts were federalized and departed from Springfield for Cuba.
The commanding officer of the 2nd Regiment in 1898, Colonel Embry Clark. Clark had served in the Civil War. He enlisted when he was 17 years of age. He fought in some of the battles down south. He got out in the latter part of, I think it was 1863, served his enlistment. And when his enlistment was up, he came home. And when the war broke out in Cuba, he was a colonel of the 2nd Regiment, so he was called into active service. Primary battle that they fought in was the Battle of El Caney, and they actually suffered more casualties from illness. For example, the food was very bad. During the actual campaign, military kitchens were not yet in active service, and a lot of the men actually came down and got sick from a combination of poor food, poor sanitation, and inadequate health care.
In 1916, the regiment was called into active federal service for the Mexican border campaign supporting the Pershing expedition. It was later commended by General Pershing for its enthusiasm, discipline, and performance.
Here was a case where they were using horse cavalry, which was the primary troops they were using to pursue Villa. Also, the Army had several scout planes, which Pershing had to kind of scout out the enemy. It was kind of a mixture of the fading out of the horse cavalry, the introduction of the airplane into active military service. And so you had that transition period. And it kind of served as a little training ground for World War I, which the Americans got into the following year in 1917. And then Pershing became the commanding officer of all the American fighting troops in Europe in World War I.
Emil Olson was a National Guardsman of the Massachusetts 2nd Regiment, later the 104th Infantry Regiment, who participated in both the Mexican border campaign and World War I. Originally from New York, born of Swedish immigrants, Emil Olson moved to Springfield in 1916 to work for the Morgan Envelope Company. Many of his tales of military service he passed on to his son, Thomas.
And it must be that as soon as he arrived in Springfield, he joined the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry militia, the Massachusetts militia, and was in that militia when the militia was activated and called to service on the Mexican border in 1916 in an effort to intercept the Mexicans who were with Pancho Villa from crossing the border. And my father was a private and a rifleman at that time. He never did, nor did any of the foot soldiers actually get into any kind of a scrape with Pancho Villa's men. They did take the prisoners that were captured by the cavalry and so forth. They did take charge of those prisoners, and some of them, of course, were in pretty bad shape. Some died, and I can remember my father telling me that the bodies were disposed of in funeral pyres.
In 1917, the United States finally joined the World War, which had engaged so many European countries since 1914. The 104th Infantry Regiment, as the 2nd Massachusetts Regiment was now known, had seen duty earlier that year guarding public utilities against possible sabotage. Once war was declared, Emil Olson joined the regiment assembled at Camp Bartlett near Westfield, where they trained until they headed overseas. The 104th was now part of the 26th Yankee Division.
And he sailed in September and arrived in Le Havre, where they disembarked, and went into training with the French troops, French instructors, hard-bitten, very tough, battle-worn French instructors, and that's where they learned. They learned bayonet warfare, parry and thrust, and trench warfare.
A National Guardsman during World War I would have been looking at many, many changes as opposed to what his ancestors that served in the militia during their periods of service. He was now equipped with modern technology, with the repeating rifle, the Springfield 1903 rifle, which was developed right up the hill from probably where he lived, the advent of wide usage of the machine gun and wide usage of rapid-fire artillery would have meant a great difference from the way he was going to serve as a militiaman as opposed to his grandfather during the Civil War or his great-great-grandfather during the American Revolution.
My father eventually worked his way up to become a supply sergeant, and that was his duty. So that in effect he wasn't actually standing in the trenches or on the trench step firing a rifle. Not that he never fired his rifle, but that wasn't his duty as an infantryman. He was a supply sergeant. And as a supply sergeant, he had a platoon of men and mules to bring supplies from the rear to the men in the front lines.
At home, there were nationwide appeals from the government to conserve resources such as metal and food for use by American troops. Communities felt a great deal of pride in their ability to contribute to the war effort. The people of Springfield did their share, buying bonds, donating food and clothing, saving peach pits for vital gas masks, and knitting, knitting, knitting.
In the Second Battle of the Marne, my father was bringing his platoon of a number of mules and men to the front when a box barrage began. One of the shells, it must have been a pretty large shell, landed very near to his mule train. It killed several mules and several of his men, wounding others, and my father was blown into the air and landed and caused damage to his kidney, ruptured a kidney, ruptured an eardrum, and he took some shrapnel in the back, and he was carried from the battlefield to an aid station, I think, unconscious, and eventually was taken to a hospital in Liverpool, England. And that's where he went with my mother. She was, I think, what they would call a gray lady.
On November 11th, 1918, armistice was declared, and the First World War was over. The 104th had distinguished itself in service, fighting in the battles of Ile-de-France, Lorraine, Aisne-Marne, where M.O. Olson was wounded, Saint-Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne, and Champagne-Marne. The regiment was decorated with the Croix de Guerre by the French government, the first American military unit ever to be decorated by a foreign power. Emil Olson, along with other veterans of the 104th who had served in World War I, held regular reunions and proudly displayed the colors on Memorial Days.
The 104th Infantry Regiment veterans turned out en masse, and it was, Main Street was, to me, in those days, was a sea of brown uniforms. And I can remember being so proud to see my father on the lead corner of his company.
After World War I, the National Guard, as the state militia were now known, continued to train. Federally recognized and equipped, the regiment was better prepared to meet the new challenges of peacetime duties.
One of the great changes in usage of National Guard units was the response to civil disasters. In the Connecticut River Valley, the great devastating floods of the 30s, where many of the individual companies of National Guard units were called up to build dikes and to rescue trapped people. Very major change in the usage of militia in not only responding to military threats, but now responding to natural threats and disasters.
Of course, 1938 was a hurricane and flood which devastated western Massachusetts. You had not only the hurricane, but the flood along with it. And much of South Holyoke at the time was inundated with water. So I was on guard back there, and then I was down at the dike area down in Springdale. That's a section of Holyoke. So those things I do remember, and we had the whole area sealed off, you know, against any vandalism or looters or anything of that sort.
You got a call on the telephone, or somebody says, "Come on, they're calling out the National Guard," and all. So you ran down to the armory. That's what I did in 1936. My brother told me to go on home. He says, "What are you doing here? Go home." I said, "But I was going to do my duty, you know." Initially, well, the water was so high that in the Union Street, Main Street area of West Springfield, we had crews going around in in rowboats to discourage any looting. We worked hard. We did our job, and felt kind of proud. And the people, of course, were very thankful. It made it easy for them, you know. And you would run across some unruly characters once in a while who would complain about they weren't getting enough food or there weren't enough blankets and stuff like that. And that's what we were there for, to be sure that someone didn't try to take over and run the whole show. Although we were young and inexperienced, I thought we did a hell of a job.
I remember the 36 flood and the 38 hurricane. That's what kind of got me interested. Seeing all these guardsmen riding boats down the streets, rescuing people and bringing food and bringing this and that. And I was an acting corporal.
You were a kid.
Yeah, I sure was. My mother was trying to get me out, but I was saying, "No, I want to go. I'm an acting corporal. I'm a big shot."
I joined the 104th Infantry under the most unusual circumstances. I was right out of high school, walking down Howard Street in the South End, and saw a building that I had not seen before with two flags. One of the flags, the American flag, which of course I recognized. The other was, I found out later, the state flag. So I walked into the building asking, "What is this building and what is that second flag?" A man came out of an office and told me that it was the National Guard Armory and that was the state flag. And I had seen the National Guard in the flood and hurricanes of a few years earlier, and he was telling me that there was a unit called the medical company that helped people, and that I should come down that evening to look into it further. Well, I did, and without knowing it, and my right arm was up, and I was in the medical company, 104th Infantry, Massachusetts National Guard.
My experiences begin back in 1938 during the Great Depression days. And of course, back then, $1 a drill, $1 a night was a lot of money back then. And of course, the Army is a great place. We had basketball, we had all the activities. You didn't have to join any other club.
In the Guard, you had a group of people who come from all likes of civilian life. And when they got together and put a uniform on, they became different. They all became, like you'd say, they all became one.
We went on 3 different maneuvers. We went on Tennessee maneuvers, Carolina maneuvers.
We used live ammunition on most of our training. We had live artillery, shells going overhead. And in one instance, some of our groups went too far forward and they were almost caught in the barrage. There were incidents where people were killed.
Then came the Tennessee maneuvers in 1944. And you could feel something coming. It was like a dress rehearsal.
One terrible incident which happened was on the Tennessee maneuvers. We would cross the river at night, probably, and one can imagine trying to cross the Connecticut River at flood stage. Now, the unit that went across, one of them, was on some sort of a raft which tumbled, and 20 men lost their lives. They drowned on that exercise.
We just came back from Carolina maneuvers, and a whole bunch of fellows from Ludlow jumped in the car and came home, which we weren't supposed to, but we did. And we were home and turned down the not television, radio, and I heard Pearl Harbor. And
so I knew, it didn't mean a thing to me, but it meant, I knew that it meant we were going to go to war. But where the hell was Pearl Harbor? So my brother, who knew everything, this guy, he said, Pearl Harbor. This is in the Hawaiian Islands. This is a naval base. So, of course, the rest of the day, you didn't know what to say to your girlfriend, and plans right then were made by a lot of people to get married right away. I know I was one of them.
All the boys that were, what was it, 28 or over, were supposed to get discharged. We got discharged, all right. We were on the trucks going to the, not the quartermaster, but to get our papers and go home. They got word that Japan struck. That was the end of everything.
In fact, I was supposed to be discharged because I was 28 years old from Camp Edwards. Then Pearl Harbor happened, right? We had just come back from
1941.
They didn't know what to do with us. We just stayed in the barracks for about a week. They wouldn't let us go out, and couldn't discharge us, and
You were on alert.
I stayed.
You were on alert.
Well, I stayed. I didn't want to go home. How do you go home, you know, when the war starts?
Everybody back then, I think, was of the same frame of mind. Don't forget that Pearl Harbor, of course, had quite an effect on the country at that time. The whole country rallied, I think, because of Pearl Harbor. Even those that were probably, you know, peace movements or anything else, when that happened, I think they all just swayed over and they had to come to the defense of their country because we were attacked. It wasn't like some of these expeditions that we have today where you go out to a foreign country and one has to doubt whether we should have been there in the first place. This was it.
Then in August 44, our commanding general, General Willard S. Paul, raised the curtain on the first act. The Yankee division was on its way.
And then we were aboard ship, and they started playing, this is coming to you directly from Argentina. And Jesus said, we're going to Argentina. Everybody thought we were going to Argentina. But nobody was smart enough to look at the boat, and we were on the SS Argentina.
And never been on a boat, and but going over on a nice clear day, we looked at one of the other ships, and there was a whole shipload of nurses, and we tried to figure out how are we going to get over there.
I spent my 19th birthday in the middle of the Atlantic
beautiful sun, 90-degree temperature. We went overseas in a convoy with 56 ships. 104th was on the flagship of the convoy. We were the first ship to land directly in France from the United States. We landed in Cherbourg.
It's a Cherbourg.
We took care of the Red Ball Highway, as they call it, Red Ball Express, while our equipment was being taken off the boat, ships. Don't tell a Navy man boat, call it a ship. And then when they got it in, then we went up on line.
And see, my job was more or less at 9, 10 o'clock at night, they would hand me a map and tell me where the troops would be by the time I got back. And then we would come back and give them rations, blankets, and whatever they needed.
Well, I was on the Red Ball Highway, and I was hauling gasoline to Patton's Army when I got hurt the second time. They put me on the Red Ball Highway, and I had a deuce and a half, and you'd carry 305-gallon cans of gasoline in the back of that truck, and you bring them up to Patton.
3,000 men out of the 26th, 10 companies. We hauled food and ammo day and night for 30 days. Millions of tons of supplies, all the way from the quays of Cherbourg, hundreds of miles to the front lines.
Military sanitation in combat. Every 90 days you got a shower. Same socks, same shoes, same clothes.
Yeah.
The guys' necks are breaking out. They're putting their handkerchiefs, you know, on their GI handkerchiefs, you know, they wouldn't show because their necks are breaking out in the back of them. Your feet are slipping around inside your shoe, you know.
At night, when things slowed down, or, you know, when we rested, everybody took their shoes off, their stockings, and would take this kind of salve, I don't remember the name of salve, and we would rub each other's feet. And the fellows that didn't do it ended up with trench feet.
Those of us that were military inclined, more apt to be, I should say, came to the head. I mean, you began to show your leadership ability a little more. You had to be sure that people paid attention to what you said.
You have to lead them. And it's not derogatory. War is hell. And you can be scared, but after a while, the fear isn't there anymore. You just go ahead. And probably you'll get hit, and maybe you won't get hit. But they do have to be led. And you got to put yourself out for them and lead them.
It was some test we took in our debut as fighters, but we passed it.
Sometimes as a unit of 6 guns, we all fire the same. We take the firing order from either the man up in the Piper Cub or from our own observer, which is up front with the 300 radio. Usually one of our top sergeants goes along with the radio man. And that's how we get our firing orders.
The scouts had been out, and they thought the Germans was digging in. What they was doing is burying mines. And this little road, I got hit just as I started up the hill. And pretty soon, American tank come along. There's a Teller mine, probably about here to the chair from me. The tank hit it, and the booby wheel flew over the top of me over on the other side. The mine that got me was got 6 in my squad.
You had to think about dying. You had to think about you know, you die just as quick from a pistol bullet than you will from a 105 shell.
And when the shells start coming in, you said that shell is going to be right on my head, right on my head.
Then on 3 November, General Patton gave us the word. Get set, strike fiercely, penetrate their lines, and keep going.
And so we started into the attack out of Moyenvik. Moyenvik and Vixasale was that little town on the Sail Canal. I remember we had to cross over the Sail Canal. It was our job to go up the hill, pass through the 4th Armored Division, who had been badly, badly beaten up.
One road we went down, and I couldn't help but looking out and seeing the German guns, the flash of red coming from their artillery. You know, this is how close they were. And then, of course, you hear the whoo, and then you duck and go down.
When we crossed the Maginot Line on December 7th, the battle for Lorraine was won, and the Third Army was solid along the German border. So the YD wrapped up its first campaign, 45 miles in 66 days of constant combat from Moyenvic across Lorraine to Germany.
We had a few guys in the outfit that we never saw again. We just assumed that they were killed in action, and then we got in the Battle of the Bulge, and we were more or less in a standstill there because we were there, so the Germans couldn't come back, you know, and we just squeezed them in, and then we had them surrounded.
If you can visualize the bulge as a pie, the pocket, the wedge was broken. The Yankee division opened up the wedge, which allowed all the other divisions to break out of the Battle of the Bulge and go on further. We went on further, and when traveling, after we got out of the Bulge, at a very rapid pace. The Germans at this point in time were practically defeated.
With the Third Army poised on the bank of the Rhine, the Yankee division again passed to the 12th Corps Command, and March 28th found them already across the Main River and into the city of Hanau. With the Nazi war machine crumbling and its last feeble efforts at defense fluid and disorganized, the YD moved rapidly into Fulda on April 1st and reduced the stronghold of Meiningen by the end of the week. From here, the drive turned southeast to sever the Munich-Berlin Autobahn, thus cutting the escape route for the high Nazi officials from the capital. Having sliced through the heart of Germany, they swung south to the Danube River and Passau by the end of April, and swiftly on into Austria, the city of Linz by May 4th. Then northeast over the border into Czechoslovakia, and there consolidating on the 6th of May. The next day, two things happened. Number one, the 85th German Corps, including the 11th Panzer Division, surrendered to the 26th Infantry Division. This was the same division we had fought on our first day of combat. Number two, we received word that the war in Europe would be over at 0001 9 May. With the war over, we stayed for a spell of occupation duty. 26th Division hadn't won the war all by itself, but we won some medals and killed some Nazis and left some buddies behind.
I remember one day, we had some replacement. It was the middle of the night. The kid come up to us in a hole, didn't even know his name. He said, "What company is it?" I said, "F, Holyoke." He said, "Oh boy, he's from Holyoke." Next day, KIA.
I want to tell you one thing that stands out in my mind more than anything that was. My best buddy was killed in a building when a shell went through the building and concussion killed him. He did not have a scar on him. I tried to beat the wind back in him, but he died in my arms. And that's the worst thing that happened to me in combat. Lived in just 2 miles of me, and didn't have a scar on him, but he's killed with concussion. I lost a lot of friends, and it all touches you. It's like he said, you don't ever forget it. I still have, after 50 years, I still wake up with nightmares because it never gets out of you what we went through. I saw men killed, great men, stout men, brave men, struck down, their life taken right then.
War was hell, and I'm only here through the grace of God, because people were killed to the left of me, to the right of me, in front of me, and back of me. In fact, some of the hits were so bad, I was going to look at this Hurwitz's body, and the lieutenant said, "If you look at him, you're going to get sick." He was hit directly with an 88 shell from German artillery.
I followed the 1st platoon most of the time, see, with my company headquarters, my runner, my radio operator and things, so that you can be in wherever the action is necessary for you to go up there. But anyway, I went up through that area, and as I was coming along, here's one of the kids holding his stomach in. Now, I'm the company commander. I went over to him and said, "Can I help you, bud?" And he didn't know much what the hell was going on either, but he was holding his guts in, you know. Well, I couldn't stay there because I had men, we were in the attack, and the men were coming and marching through. And I often wonder to this day whether that soldier lived or not.
We ended up in Czechoslovakia. So we proceeded on into Budweis. When we got there, there's a city square, which is about a quarter of a mile across, and must have been 100,000 people there. The thing was just jammed with people. There's a big fountain in the middle. And some people came out and told us to come in, that they wanted to honor us, so we started going around. It took us about 2 hours to drive around that square. And people came up jumping on the trucks and hugging and kissing us, men and women. They're presenting us with food and giving us bottles of wine, whiskey, and whatnot. Our anti-tank guns, you couldn't see them, but there were so many flowers on them.
The Germans I felt sorry for, because many of the ones that I've seen that were dead, and I've seen their pictures of their children and their rosary beads and the pictures of their little children, just like us. They were only soldiers. They were Wehrmacht. And then in Mannheim, outside of Steyr, I've seen the furnaces and the coal cars and the bodies in the coal cars that were ready to be burned. And then that sickened me to death, you know. But this is something you can't forget.
Right after the war ended, they had to start bringing in replacements, and we said, what's going on? Just like another war is starting, you know. So what's going on? They said, we're going to invade Japan. And then all of us was getting 10-day leave to Paris. And I was on my way down to Paris, and I heard a rumor about something had been dropped, which was atomic bombs, you know.
As the first American military unit to have been decorated by a foreign power, the 104th is unique in our history. On Sunday, April 28, 1918, General Posada of the French 32nd Army Corps, acting in the name of the French government, affixed the unit citation of the Croix de Guerre to the regimental colors of the 104th. I am proud to decorate the flag of a regiment which has shown such fortitude and courage. 117 individual Croix de Guerre awards were also made at this time to officers and men of the 104th. As if being the first to receive a foreign award were not enough, the 104th became the only American unit to receive a second Croix de Guerre. After the close of hostilities in World War II, on November 27, 1945, the 104th was again honored by the French government. At Camp Pittsburgh, near Rennes, France, the Croix de Guerre, this time with palms and the coveted fourragère, was again pinned to the regimental colors, recognizing the valor and service of the 104th and making it the only organization in the United States military to have been so honored in 2 world wars.
The officers of World War II that started the Guard in this location, they were all World War II veterans, and they brought with them the experience and the knowledge and the integrity, and that's what got me really excited about serving my country and continuing to get the education required and the promotions necessary to do the job that I wanted to do. The years 1949, when I enlisted, through 1962, 63, were great years, interesting years, and we learned a lot. Collectively in companies, a company being about 150 individuals, and we learned how to fight as a company with the rifle platoons and the mortar platoon supporting. But it was the Berlin crisis in '61, I believe, where the Department of Army decided that the National Guard had a greater role in containing the Cold War problems and getting more involved in the overall picture. So it was the mid-'60s where we started to go into battalion-level operations. And there we started to get all the supporting factors of a battalion, to include the artillery and the air support. And it made things very, very interesting and exciting. Around 1975, 1976, the Department of Army started to give the National Guard up-to-date equipment. We started to get equipment right from the factory, trucks and weapons. I recall very vividly, we transitioned from the M1 Garand right into the M16, bypassing the M14 completely. That's how important the Department of Army started to look at the Army National Guard, which at that time numbered across the nation 410,000 soldiers. So I think that at this point in time, from the battalion operations in 65 to the new equipment coming into the Guard in 75 and 78, that's what started to make the entire country look at the National Guard as a strong supporting element in the Cold War. As a young man, 17, 18 years old, and you find a new group of friends and you build camaraderie, there wasn't much sacrifice. You rather enjoyed it. You had a good time, you learned to soldier, all those individual qualities of marksmanship and drill and ceremonies you continue to enjoy. As you may recall in history, the 104th Infantry Regiment, which was based in Springfield, had about 22 to 2,500 soldiers. And as time evolved and as the Department of Army changed the organizations, we soon ended up with 2 infantry battalions of the 104th Infantry. And it was not long ago, probably about 7 years ago, that the 2nd Battalion, 104th Infantry, had to fold its colors, and currently, today, we are with 1 battalion, the 1st Battalion, 104th Infantry Station in Westfield, with about 750 soldiers.
In the future, the Guard will continue in its mission of safeguarding and aiding the community during natural disasters and in times of civil unrest. It will continue its mission of defending our state and our nation against aggressors and upholding our national interests around the world. But the Guard of the future will be more closely integrated with the regular Army for purposes of training and organization. This will be achieved through implementation of light infantry brigades, which will include 1 National Guard company with every 2 companies of regular Army troops. This will result in utilization of common equipment, common training, and establishment of common readiness standards. Adaptive forces will be developed that will be best suited to discharge the many diverse and complex tasks that the military will be called upon to perform in the next century.
The Guard for me, the 104th Infantry for me, is very, very important, as it was part of my life for 43 years.
Just as the 104th Regiment is rich in tradition and history, so too is the regimental shield rich in symbolism. The color blue stands for the present. White represents the past, recalling continuous service since 1639. The torch indicates origin as a colonial train band regiment, and the 3 flames signify 3 centuries of service. The arrowhead recalls service during the French and Indian Wars. The Cross of St. George recalls service during the Revolution and the War of 1812. The chevron, formed by the white and blue divisions at the top of the shield, represents the bloody angle at Spotsylvania during the Civil War. The castle-like top of the torch commemorates the Santiago campaign of the Spanish-American War. The 6 stars represent the major engagements of World War I, in which the 104th participated: Chemin des Dames, Apremont, Campagne Marne, Aisne-Marne, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne. A crest sometimes appears over the shield, a powerful sword-wielding arm. That is the crest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the home state of the 104th. Beneath the shield appears the motto, Fortitude et Courage, fortitude and courage, adopted by the regiment on the battlefields of France in World War I, taking the quote from General Passaga of the French Army, who awarded the regiment the unit citation of the Croix de Guerre. Through those centuries of service, the unbroken threads of commitment, preparedness, and bravery have been woven into an enduring legacy in which we can all take pride. In this brief examination of the history of the military units which evolved into the 104th Infantry Regiment, that legacy has been evoked and the memory perpetuated. For the Connecticut Valley Historical Museum, I'm John Curtis. Thank you for watching.
Fire.
Approaching now is the 3rd Brigade, 26th Yankee Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel William Whitman. The command sergeant major is Lyman H.